For our next project, we're going to be using site measuring. Some of you may have heard of site measuring before, and what site measuring is really about is how to flatten the three-dimensional world to a flat two-dimensional plane. Some of the techniques that we're going to be using for this project come from drawing in the right side of the brain. Betty Edwards talks about this idea in her book, and it's one of the reasons we use the imagined person in our first little drawing project. Um, and she talks about the idea that when we first start to draw, oftentimes we think of things as symbols. So, for example, the symbol of the eye is sort of that football shape with two little circles in it. We know that that's a symbol for the eye. But if we look at an actual eye, there's a whole lot more going on, right? It's this sphere with a flap of skin folded over top of it. It's actually a very complicated shape and form. And this is something that artists have been really thinking about for centuries. And it wasn't until the Renaissance that artists really thought about how they can take that three-dimensional world and flatten it into a two-dimensional space. And they did it through what they considered a series of scientific understanding of the world through drawing. So they thought that they could um, go about this in a really sort of scientific, measured way, hence the idea of site measuring. And Albert Dürer wrote the first book on site measuring, known as A Treatise on Measurement. And in that book is one of the objects we've already talked about, which is the Dürer machine. The Dürer machine was built on the idea that if I went and I looked out the window and I see that three-dimensional world outside of it, and I took a marker and I drew everything I saw in that three-dimensional world on that window pane, I would get a perfect flat two-dimensional representation of that three-dimensional world flattened to a two-dimensional plane. Now, the idea of the window within the Renaissance was also important. They often thought about artwork as being sort of a window to another world. It was something that your imagination could step through this window. So oftentimes you'll even see them use actual window edging on paintings if you see some paintings from the Renaissance. Now, we can see some aspects of that idea of the window pane on Drewer here within this image. So you see the actual little pane there, and there's lines within it, and then there's lines on the ground so he can copy exactly what's in each one of those little squares on the little squares in front of him. And there's one other little detail that we haven't talked about that yet. That's that stick that he's sort of looking through with his eye. One thing with sight measuring, it's very important that you don't change the way you're looking at it. So if I move significantly, those measurements change significantly. So it's really important that you, as the artist, when you're sight measuring, don't move. So built into his Dürer machine was something that the artist had to come back to. So they would keep coming back to that perfect view. You can see him there looking through that viewfinder, is what they called it. So we have made our own viewfinders. Now, part of this idea is that when we're looking through the viewfinder, as I move it in and out, it's actually changing what is in the piece, right? So we can make different compositions using using our viewfinder, but we can also use it for some beginning stages of measuring. So once I figure out where I want things at, I can actually use the edges of my viewfinder, mark where I see those tops of objects, mark where I see the bottoms of objects or where they hit the edge. I can also look and see where there might be overlapping areas, right? There's a little bit of an edge there. So I'm actually trying to use this as a a measuring tool to see where I can sort of map things out. So this is sort of the first step in figuring out how to map out my drawing. So you can see I've tried to look and I've tried to kind of map out general directions where things are going to be at. Not only whether the top of that sippy cup, but maybe where um, the lid and the body interact. I'm trying to just get things in big general shapes. And when you go to start your paper, if you notice, I've got my thumbnail sketches sort of mapped out on the side where I've changed the shape of my viewfinder and thought about what I'm going to draw. But I also have set up a border. So when I go to draw, you'll see shortly here in the little demo, when I go to draw, I'm going to have room to make those same kinds of marks around the border. So I can kind of mark out my big general shapes where I'm going to start things off. The second thing that I'm going to use that's going to help me with my sight measuring is what's known as a sighting stick. Now, you've probably seen artists use this before, use their thumb. The idea is that you're using your pencil to measure with. And there's a couple big general rules. One is that you can't move where you're standing. You have to stay in the same spot. The idea of the sight stick is sort of the idea that it's proportional, right? That you can't change where the movement is going to be. The other thing, because this is based off of that idea of the window pane, you have to measure along the same plane. So you can't dip your pencil in or out. It has to remain vertical, horizontal, somewhere along that imaginary window pane. And it should be the same distance from you. So it's very important that you keep one eye closed and your elbow straight. So you remain along that same picture plane, never letting your pencil dip in or out of that imaginary glass pane that's in front of you. So always remember you're keeping one eye closed and that elbow straight. That's sort of the first rule for sight measuring. Now, when you go to start the measuring itself, the idea of it that we're going to talk about is its comparative measurement. So you're using your pencil to measure things with. So if you're trying to measure something, the tip of your pencil starts at the end. The other end of your measurement is your thumb. So that's the distance that you're measuring. And you're going to take that same measurement and compare it to somewhere else in your objects. So we'll look at some examples of that. So what can you compare, right? The possibilities are almost sort of endless, right? We'll talk about a few today, but we're going to look at our objects and think about what we can compare. Some examples of some things are height to width, one part of the object to another, one object to another object in the composition, or even the negative spaces or spaces in between. So here's one of the objects from my still life. So as I'm sight measuring them, one of the things that I can measure is height to width. So the first thing I'm going to do is take a measurement of the width of my object. So you can see I've used my pencil end. I've taken and measured, put the edge along one edge of the mason jar there. The other edge is along my thumb. And then I'm going to compare it to the height of the mason jar. So I then take that same measurement. Remember, my elbow is locked. If you want to test this theory out, you can always, with one eye closed, move that pencil closer to you, move it further away. It's going to change your measurement. So it's very important you keep that elbow locked. So I'm taking that same measurement from before, and I'm seeing how far it goes up the height of my mason jar. So you can see it's over half. So I'm then going to raise my pencil up, and I'm going to see how much further up the charcoal pencil it goes. So the width to height ratio is about 1 width to 1.5 width to height. So you can see I've got about 1.5 widths to get to the top of that mason jar. The comparative measurement that I can look at is to look at the tops and the bottoms of objects. So if I take my sight measuring stick and I see how far that bottom of the object goes. So even though they're sitting on a nice flat table, I know technically they're sitting at the same height. In that flattened three-dimensional world, the bottoms are actually at different heights, right? So you can see the bottom of the mason jar actually hits halfway across the sippy cup, and the bottom of the sippy cup is a very far distance from the bottom of the mason jar. So that's one thing you can look for. The top of my sippy cup goes about 2/3 of the way up the mason jar in this one, right? So it's actually goes up a significant height. The other thing you can measure are the negative spaces or the spaces in between objects. So I can actually see how far the height of my object of the mason jar goes, or see if there's an avocado distance in between the mason jar and the sippy cup. Those are sort of some of the comparative measurements you can make. Another one is using the edges. So I can look at the edge of the cup and see where it hits in my avocado, or I could compare the edge of the avocado and see where it sits in the sippy cup. Those are all those kinds of comparing one object to another in the composition itself. I can also think about looking at creating a central axis along my objects and trying to find the angles that they're at. Now, it's very important again to remember, don't let that pencil dip when you're trying to measure an angle. The pencil has to remain perfectly flat, right? Sometimes you can compare it to perfectly vertical. So if I hold the pencil up, I can try to figure out the angle that for example, here the mason jar is going back at, or I can hold the angle of the pencil along that central axis so I can figure it out. I then can take that exact angle and put it down on my page. It's going to help me figure out the angle that it's heading back at. Now, the idea is that we're actually going to draw out all these lines on our paper. So as we're drawing, we're not going to erase any of the lines out until we start to do the details. But all these lines are going to help us figure out how to get these shapes the correct proportions. So for example, if I'm looking at a bottle, you can see I've got a central axis line going down the middle there to help me figure out the kind of general shape. And then I'm using all those other lines, the comparative measurements that I looked at, to help me get everything sort of in the right spaces. And it's we're going to practice on something as simple as bottles today, but this process can be used for very complex objects, for people, for complex organic shapes like trees. It can be used for almost anything. Okay, so let's see if I can get this video to start. Um, So what you're going to use to do your underdrawing and your measurements with, you can see I've got my newsprint paper there. I'm going to use vine charcoal. And your vine should come a couple different sizes. You should use the skinnier one. So if you pull out your vine charcoal, usually there's a fat one and a skinny one. The skinny one's a little bit easier to do this with. We'll use the fatter pieces of vine later on when we get to value. So Um, the nice thing about vine, it's actually vine that's been taken off of a tree and it's been made into charcoal. It's very easy to erase. That's why we're going to use it for our beginning measurements. You can see I've got my viewfinder there. I've got those initial marks that I use to kind of map out my composition. And I'm proportionally putting those marks along the edge of my paper. So you can let things go off of the page as you draw. You can put marks in that border. The idea is that it's not really a part of your drawing, but it's part of your measuring space. So if I was to take this drawing later and actually want to frame it, I can trim it or I can mat it around to that actual edge, and all those outside stuff you're not going to see. So it's just kind of a part of your work area. All right, so once I have things mapped out, I'm I'm actually going to just try to map out the heights and widths of each of the objects without drawing any details. So I'm doing no details first. I'm just doing, height, width, where is this object going to fit within the composition. So as I map things out, I'm using those guides from my viewfinder, but I'm also using my sighting stick because, you know, sometimes it can be difficult to super accurately mark each one of those marks as you're using your viewfinder. It's just kind of a starting point so I can make sure that I fit everything in that I want to. But I'm going to use my sight measuring stick to refine all those things. So I'm actually going to look at my height and width and try to um, map those out within it. All right, so once I get those heights and widths mapped out, um, I can actually go into um, some some even more detail. Like now, I'm starting to look at some of those central axis points to map out the details in between. Make sure as you're measuring, I'm making sure that my height and my width of the object, so I'm comparative measuring the height and width. Um, and if it's off from your original measurements on your viewfinder, that's okay too. Make sure that you're far enough away from your still life that you can use those measuring tools, because sometimes if you're too close, you can't fully extend your arm. Um, but if you're sitting back a little bit from the table, that should be enough room. That's where your drawing board comes in handy. Um, so as you start going, if you make a mistake, don't bother going through and erasing it all out. We're going to kind of let some of these lines exist. And you can actually easily erase most of them with just your finger. In your charcoal pencil kit, if you got it from the school, there is a kneaded eraser. It's that gummy eraser. This works really well to erase the vine charcoal. So as I go through, you can see I'm kind of starting to refine some of the edges, but I'm not doing any fine detail lines yet. That you're going to save till the very end once I make sure everything's in the right spot. I'm not going to use my compressed charcoal or my charcoal pencil until I'm sure I have everything where it's supposed to be at, everything's the correct proportions, everything looks sort of in the right general area. And if you're drawing, for example, in my composition, I chose the top of my mason jars going off my page. Feel free to let it go off that page if it helps you find the angle correctly, because remember, that's kind of my extra space that I can use. The other thing, as I mentioned, to pick things that are cylindrical, drawing that central axis line can actually help you to kind of draw the arc or the edge of that cylinder, because it gives you something to kind of compare it to, because I know it's symmetrical, so one side's going to match the other. Okay, so the next step in this, once I have things kind of mapped out in the right space, I'm going to use my charcoal pencil. You could also use your compressed charcoal sticks for this. I'm going to go in and I'm going to start to refine my line. So as I go, I can kind of smudge out with my finger or your kneaded eraser some of those extra vine lines. I'm going to look and try to carefully think about doing line variation, seeing, how much I can vary those edges. Um, and as you go, you can rub it out with your finger. You can get your kneaded eraser out. I'm going to do the sped up version here. Let's see. There it goes. So as you're going, you're refining using that edge. My final edge is going to be the compressed charcoal. I'm not doing any shadows or anything yet. The reason for that is that shadows can hide things. Um, Also, try to pick up on some fine details in the interiors and some interesting edges. and line variation. Part of your goal is that you're going to try to bring in some of those details, not just general shapes. That's sort of the last phase that you're going to come in with the charcoal pencil. So just to kind of go over what you're doing again, you're going to set up your own still life at home. It has to be 3 objects or more. Think about finding simple shapes around your house, so shapes that are cylindrical, ovals, spheres. You could find organic shapes like one of mine I used was an avocado or an orange or an apple, those kinds of things. Avoid using any boxes for now. We're going to get to the boxes later when we do linear perspective. It's actually a little bit harder, especially when we're beginning sight measuring, so it's going to be easier to use either round or slightly irregular objects. Avoid things that have labels or names on it. They're actually labels are really hard to draw on a cylinder, so especially because we're just kind of practicing the sight measuring and how to use the viewfinder. Sometimes that can be a little more challenge than we're trying to take on at this point. Set up the bottom so that they don't align. So don't try to put everything nice and flat and in, a nice little line row. Set some closer to you, set some further away. That's going to help you practice the sight measuring and comparative measurements. Try to pick things that have something that catches your eye for detail. So, like one of the reasons I picked the mason jar was it had those neat little sort of screw top at the top that I thought would be interesting to draw, or the little bit of the textured edge on the avocado. Find something like that that's got a little bit of detail. So the drawing itself, remember you should be using the newsprint paper. Use the whole page, but with a border. So you have to create a border around the edge, so it's going to give you room to do the sight measuring. You should be doing 4 thumbnails that may be on the same page. They don't have to be on the same page, but if you want to put them on there, you can. Use your vine charcoal for the underdrawing. So remember, vine is the one that's kind of that irregular looking charcoal. It's softer. If you use your charcoal pencil or your compressed charcoal for the underdrawing, it's going to be impossible to erase. You want something that's light and easy to erase as you're doing all those kind of beginning mark makings. You're going to use the compressed charcoal or charcoal pencil for the line drawing itself. So that's what you're coming in with the end with and doing all the details. This drawing should be line only, no shadows. We'll get to shading later on. I'm not anti-shadows, but you can actually really hide mistakes in measuring with shadows. So when you learn first how to sight measure, the idea is that you're just looking for lines and edges and measuring the size, and you can make something look a little slimmer with some shading, or a little fatter by making it a little bit whiter. So we're trying to avoid doing those things with shading. We're really just trying to go for accurate measuring right now. Last part, think about trying to make this into a interesting drawing using lines. So that's the challenge. Without shading, you're trying to create something that's interesting. All right, so you can get started with your drawings.